June 17, 1944. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito stood in the command bunker beneath Mount Tapochau, studying reconnaissance photographs that his intelligence staff had spread across the operations table. The images showed Saipan's western beaches transformed into what appeared to be a small American city materialized overnight. Endless rows of supply dumps, fuel depots, ammunition stockpiles, and vehicle parks stretched inland from the invasion beaches, like geometric patterns drawn by some mad architect who recognized no constraints of scarcity or limitation. His staff had been counting, calculating, measuring the impossible tonnages flowing ashore with mechanical precision that grew more disturbing with each passing day. 100 to 65,000 tons in 3 weeks. The number sat in Saito's handwritten report like an accusation, a mathematical proof of Japan's inevitable defeat written in logistics statistics rather than casualty figures. His hand trembled slightly as he traced the columns of figures his intelligence officers had compiled through systematic observation of American supply operations. Each line represented tons of ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, construction materials, and equipment categories that Japanese logistics doctrine barely acknowledged as necessary for combat operations. What disturbed him most was not the volume itself, but what it revealed about the fundamental nature of warfare his nation had failed to understand. The Americans were not fighting a battle. They were executing an industrial operation, and Japan had brought swords to a factory. The photographs spread before Saito showed supply dumps organized with precision that suggested systematic planning rather than improvised responses to immediate needs. Ammunition stockpiles, segregated by caliber and type, occupied designated areas marked with standardized signs visible even in reconnaissance images. Fuel storage tanks clustered near vehicle parks, where hundreds of trucks, jeeps, and tracked vehicles sat in orderly rows waiting for missions that would distribute supplies throughout American-controlled territory. Medical tents flew Red Cross flags that marked field hospitals, equipped with surgical facilities Japanese military doctors could only dream of accessing. The entire logistics infrastructure visible in these photographs represented organizational capacity that exceeded anything Saito had witnessed during 26 years of military service across China, Manchuria, and the Pacific Islands. Colonel Takashi Hirakushi, Saito's senior intelligence officer, stood beside the operations table with additional documentation that quantified what the photographs revealed qualitatively. His reports contained tonnage estimates calculated through systematic observation of cargo operations, vessel counts, and supply dump measurements that intelligence teams had compiled since the American invasion began on June 15th. Told a story that contradicted everything Japanese military doctrine taught about how modern armies functioned in combat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant General Saito had assumed command of Saipan's defense in February 1944, inheriting a garrison of 32,000 troops tasked with holding an island that Japanese strategic planners considered the critical anchor of their inner defensive perimeter. Saipan's fall would bring American bombers within range of Tokyo itself, transform the Marianas into forward bases for invasion fleets that could strike at Japan's home islands, and sever the maritime lifeline connecting the empire's industrial heartland to resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia and the occupied territories of the southern regions. The island's defense represented not just a tactical challenge, but a test of Japan's ability to sustain its empire against opponents whose material capabilities remained incompletely understood by command authorities in Tokyo. Saito approached his assignment with the systematic mindset of a career officer trained in traditional military science at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy during the 1920s, an era when Japan's military establishment studied European warfare methods and adapted them to Asian operational requirements. His education had emphasized tactical excellence, aggressive offensive operations, and the spiritual superiority of Japanese warriors over enemies corrupted by materialism and soft living. The curriculum devoted extensive time to analyzing Napoleon's campaigns, the German victories in the Franco-Prussian War, and Japan's own stunning triumph over Russia in 1905, when superior fighting spirit and tactical audacity had overcome an opponent with greater industrial resources. But Saito also possessed an analytical nature that distinguished him from colleagues who dismissed intelligence reports contradicting established doctrine. He had served in Manchuria during the 1930s, where he witnessed the grinding realities of logistics-dependent warfare against Chinese forces who refused to offer the decisive battles Japanese tactical doctrine demanded. He studied his enemy's capabilities, with the same attention other officers devoted to Bushido philosophy, seeking patterns that might explain American success across the Pacific theater during the previous 2 years of increasingly desperate defensive campaigns. The intelligence briefings Saito received during his first weeks on Saipan painted a disturbing picture of American operational methods that contradicted everything Japanese doctrine taught about warfare. Reports from Tarawa, where Japanese defenders had inflicted heavy casualties on American Marines in November 1943, nevertheless described amphibious assaults, supported by naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, that exceeded anything experienced during Japan's campaigns in China or Southeast Asia. More concerning were accounts from Kwajalein and Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands, where American forces had demonstrated refined amphibious techniques that combined overwhelming firepower with systematic infantry advances that seized objectives with minimal casualties compared to earlier operations. Most troubling were the logistics reports from these previous battles. Intelligence analysts in Tokyo had compiled estimates suggesting American assault forces consumed supplies at rates that exceeded Japanese garrison requirements by factors of 5 to 10. Artillery expenditures alone dwarfed Japanese ammunition stocks, with American batteries firing thousands of shells in preparatory bombardments that sometimes lasted days before infantry ever approached defended beaches. Medical supplies, food rations, and fuel deliveries sustained operations at tempos Japanese forces could not match even when supply lines remained intact and functioning at optimal capacity. The pattern suggested that Americans approached warfare as an engineering problem requiring overwhelming material resources rather than a test of warrior spirit and tactical skill that Japanese doctrine emphasized. Saito ordered his staff to construct detailed defensive plans that acknowledged these realities, rather than indulging fantasies about Japanese spiritual superiority, overcoming material disadvantages through sheer determination. The resulting strategy emphasized prepared positions in Saipan's mountainous interior, where terrain might partially offset American firepower advantages and create conditions where Japanese tactical skills could operate more effectively. Coastal defenses would delay landing operations and inflict maximum casualties during the vulnerable phase when American troops transitioned from landing craft to secured beachheads, but Saito harbored no illusions about preventing American forces from establishing themselves ashore once they committed to assault with the resources intelligence suggested they would deploy. The defensive plan incorporated lessons from previous campaigns where Japanese forces had attempted to stop American landings at the water's edge, only to see coastal fortifications obliterated by naval gunfire that reduced concrete bunkers to rubble before infantry ever came ashore. Instead, Saito positioned his main defensive strength in depth across Saipan's interior, where mobility and concealment might preserve combat power that could be employed in coordinated counterattacks rather than consumed in static defense of positions that American firepower could methodically destroy. The island's geography offered some advantages for defenders willing to abandon traditional Japanese offensive tactics that emphasized aggressive charges and close combat, where spiritual factors might offset material disadvantages. Mount Tapochau dominated Saipan's interior, rising 1,500 feet above the surrounding terrain and providing observation positions that overlooked the entire southern half of the island. The mountain slopes and the rough terrain surrounding it would force American forces to fight uphill against prepared fortifications, where geography partially offset their advantages in artillery and armored vehicles. Caves honeycombing the limestone cliffs could shelter troops and supplies from naval bombardment that had proven so devastating at Tarawa and other island battles, while the northern plateau's rugged terrain would channel attackers into killing zones where Japanese defenders might achieve temporary tactical successes even against overwhelmingly superior forces. But even these geographical advantages could not compensate for the logistical disparities that Saito's staff identified through careful study of American operational patterns in previous campaigns. Japanese doctrine assumed that determined defenders required only basic supplies of ammunition, rice rations sufficient for minimal nutrition, and the will to fight until death or victory. American operations suggested their forces required elaborate support systems that delivered not just ammunition and food, but medical supplies for sophisticated field hospitals capable of performing surgery under combat conditions, fuel for thousands of vehicles that multiplied mobility and cargo capacity beyond what human or animal transport could achieve, spare parts for complex equipment that Japanese forces simply abandoned when mechanical failures occurred, and specialized munitions for different tactical situations rather than the general-purpose ammunition Japanese logistics provided. Japanese supply lines to Saipan had grown increasingly tenuous throughout early 1944 as American submarines and aircraft decimated merchant convoys, attempting to deliver reinforcements and supplies to garrisons throughout the Central Pacific. The island's garrison survived on stockpiles, accumulated before American naval forces tightened their blockade, with no realistic prospect of resupply, once battle commenced against an enemy who clearly possessed maritime dominance throughout the region. Saito calculated his forces possessed perhaps 60 days of ammunition at normal combat consumption rates and 90 days of food. If rationing was strictly enforced and troops maintained discipline about not wasting scarce resources on unauthorized activities. These estimates assume Japanese troops would fight with the efficiency and supply discipline drilled into them during training, consuming ammunition only for aimed fire against identified targets rather than the suppressive fire that American doctrine employed. They also assumed that naval supply runs might deliver at least some additional material before American blockade forces made such missions completely impossible. By June 1944, Saito understood both assumptions had proven overly optimistic, as American submarines and aircraft had made resupply operations suicidal even before the invasion fleet appeared off Saipan's coast. The American invasion fleet appeared off Saipan's western coast on June 30, 1944, comprising over 300 vessels that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction Saito's observers could see. From his command post on Mount Tapochau, Saito observed the armada through field glasses, counting battleships whose massive main batteries could hurl 1-ton shells across miles of ocean with accuracy that previous generation naval guns could never achieve. Aircraft carriers, some of them among the largest warships ever constructed, steamed in formation protected by screens of cruisers and destroyers that seemed to number in the dozens surrounding each capital ship. More disturbing were the dozens of specialized vessels, whose purposes remained unclear but whose presence suggested logistical capabilities that Japanese intelligence had failed to adequately assess or incorporate into defensive planning. Transport ships riding low in the water clearly carried enormous cargo loads that would soon begin flowing ashore once landing operations commenced. Tank landing ships, a vessel type Japanese naval architects had never considered necessary, possessed bow ramps that would allow them to beach themselves and disgorge vehicles directly onto sand without requiring port facilities or cargo handling equipment. Smaller landing craft clustered around the transports in numbers that suggested the Americans possessed sufficient assault boats to land thousands of troops in simultaneous waves rather than the sequential landing operations that Japanese amphibious doctrine employed when conducting offensive operations. Cruiser and destroyer guns swept beach areas with curtains of high explosive that transformed defensive positions into terrain so thoroughly disrupted that even recognizing former fortification locations became impossible for Japanese observers who had memorized every defensive position before the bombardment began. The naval gunfire delivered shells according to carefully planned schedules rather than random harassment barrages, with different calibers and shell types employed for specific target categories. Heavy battleship guns demolished major fortifications and concrete emplacements, while smaller destroyer weapons swept beach areas, clear of obstacles, and prepared positions where infantry might shelter during landing operations. Aircraft from the carriers offshore dropped bombs and napalm with precision that suggested sophisticated targeting systems rather than the crude area bombing Japanese forces employed when air support was available at all. Dive bombers attacked individual fortifications with accuracy that placed bombs within meters of intended targets, while torpedo bombers adapted their weapons to deliver devastating strikes against coastal defensive positions. Fighter aircraft strafed surviving Japanese positions with machine gun and rocket fire that killed defenders who had survived the naval bombardment and aerial bombing. The coordination between different strike aircraft, naval gunfire, and what appeared to be forward, observers directing fire from positions close to Japanese lines, revealed planning sophistication that Japanese amphibious doctrine had never considered necessary for successful operations. What troubled Saito more than the bombardment's intensity was its systematic nature that suggested careful planning rather than overwhelming force applied indiscriminately. American gunfire methodically worked through predetermined target lists rather than firing random harassment barrages designed to suppress defenders psychologically. Naval observers aboard spotting aircraft adjusted fire based on observed results, concentrating firepower on positions that showed continued resistance while bypassing areas already neutralized to conserve ammunition for targets that required additional attention. The coordination between naval guns, aircraft, and what appeared to be underwater demolition teams clearing beach obstacles revealed planning sophistication that assumed sufficient time and resources to methodically prepare landing areas rather than accepting casualties from hasty assaults against intact defenses. Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized inflicting maximum casualties on attackers during the vulnerable transition from ship to shore, assuming that American forces would rush ashore in desperate assaults that defenders could meet with concentrated fire from prepared positions. The 3-day bombardment that preceded actual landing operations demonstrated how completely American methods diverged from Japanese assumptions about amphibious warfare. Rather than risking troops against intact defenses, Americans devoted days to systematically destroying defensive positions, accepting delays in the operation's timeline in exchange for reducing casualties during the actual landing phase. The landing operations that began on the morning of June 15th demonstrated the full scope of American logistical capabilities in ways that rendered Saito's defensive preparations largely irrelevant to the battle's outcome. The first waves came ashore in specialized landing craft that delivered troops directly onto beaches despite heavy surf and remaining Japanese defensive fire from positions that had survived the preparatory bombardment. Amtraks, amphibious tractors that could traverse water and then continue inland across rough terrain, carried Marines from ships offshore directly to positions hundreds of yards inland, bypassing beach obstacles and defensive positions designed to stop troops at the water's edge. Behind the assault infantry came waves of vehicles, artillery pieces, and supplies loaded onto amphibious craft that shuttled continuously between the invasion fleet and expanding beachheads in a ballet of logistics that never seemed to pause or falter despite Japanese artillery fire and occasional air attacks from the few remaining Japanese aircraft that could reach Saipan from bases elsewhere in the Deux Marianas. Tank landing ships beached themselves bow first and dropped ramps that allowed tanks, trucks, and bulldozers to drive directly onto sand and immediately begin supporting operations or constructing infrastructure. The cargo flow appeared continuous rather than episodic, suggesting supply planning that anticipated requirements rather than reacting to emergencies as Japanese logistics typically operated. Saito's forward observers, positioned in caves on Mount Tapochau, reported scenes that seemed incomprehensible to officers trained in Japanese logistics methods that emphasized minimal consumption and maximum endurance of hardship. American troops established supply dumps on the beaches within hours of landing, accumulating ammunition, rations, water, and medical supplies faster than Japanese forces could interdict them through counterattacks that foundered against American defensive firepower. Bulldozers carved roads through beach obstacles and inland terrain, creating transportation networks that allowed rapid movement of supplies from shore to frontline positions, while Japanese forces still relied on human porters, carrying supplies along jungle paths vulnerable to ambush and exhaustion. Within 24 hours of the initial landing, Americans had constructed what appeared to be permanent supply installations that exceeded the capacity of facilities Japanese forces had built over months of preparation. Tents organized in neat rows housed command posts, aid stations, and supply distribution points. Vehicle parks accommodated hundreds of trucks and jeeps, organized by unit designation rather than haphazardly abandoned wherever space existed. Fuel bladders, large rubber containers holding thousands of gallons of gasoline and diesel, clustered near vehicle assembly areas, where mechanics performed maintenance using spare parts American logistics delivered as routinely as ammunition and rations. The entire logistics infrastructure operated with efficiency that suggested extensive training and standardized procedures rather than improvised responses to unexpected challenges. The artillery support American infantry received particularly astounded Japanese observers, accustomed to carefully rationed fire missions, where each shell represented precious resources that might not be replaced once exhausted. American guns fired continuously, delivering shells in quantities that suggested unlimited ammunition supplies existed somewhere in the supply chain feeding frontline batteries. Forward observers coordinated fire missions through radio communications that allowed near-instantaneous response to infantry requests for support, while counter-battery fire targeted Japanese guns with accuracy that suggested sophisticated detection equipment rather than visual observation alone. Japanese artillery doctrine emphasized surprise and concealment, with batteries firing brief missions before displacing to alternate positions to avoid counter-battery fire. American doctrine appeared to assume that ammunition availability made sustained fire support more valuable than conservation, with batteries firing for hours from single positions without apparent concern about depleting ammunition, stocks, or revealing locations to enemy fire direction. The philosophical difference reflected broader disparities in logistics capacity, with Japanese forces treating ammunition as scarce resource to be conserved, while American forces employed firepower as the primary method of reducing casualties and accelerating advances. Saito's intelligence officer, Colonel Takashi Hirakushi, had compiled detailed analyses of previous American amphibious operations, attempting to identify patterns that might inform Saipan's defense. The reports revealed consistent characteristics that challenged Japanese assumptions about how battles unfolded. American forces never rushed ashore in desperate assaults that Japanese defenders could meet with aggressive counterattacks. Instead, they established secure beachheads, consolidated positions, and advanced methodically behind massive artillery barrages and airstrikes that pulverized defensive positions before infantry ever made contact. The logistical component of American operations particularly troubled Hirakushi's analysis. Intelligence estimates suggested American assault forces consumed supplies at rates that exceeded Japanese garrison requirements by factors of 5 to 10. Artillery expenditures alone dwarfed Japanese ammunition stocks, while medical supplies, food rations, and fuel deliveries sustained operations at tempos Japanese forces could not match even when supply lines remained intact. The pattern suggested that Americans approached warfare as an engineering problem requiring overwhelming material resources rather than a test of warrior spirit and tactical skill. Saito ordered his staff to construct detailed defensive plans that acknowledged these realities rather than indulging fantasies about Japanese spiritual superiority overcoming material disadvantages. The resulting strategy emphasized prepared positions in Saipan's mountainous interior, where terrain might partially offset American firepower advantages. Coastal defenses would delay landing operations and inflict maximum casualties, but Saito harbored no illusions about preventing American forces from establishing beachheads once they committed to assault. The island's geography offered some advantages for defenders willing to abandon traditional Japanese offensive tactics. Mount Tapochau dominated Saipan's interior, providing observation positions and defensive terrain that would force American forces to fight uphill against prepared fortifications. Caves, honeycombing. The limestone cliffs could shelter troops and supplies from naval bombardment, while the northern plateau's rugged terrain would channel attackers into killing zones where Japanese defenders might partially offset American artillery superiority through careful positioning. But even these geographical advantages could not compensate for the logistical disparities that Saito's staff identified through careful study of American operational patterns. Japanese doctrine assumed that determined defenders required only basic supplies, ammunition, and the will to fight. American operations suggested their forces required elaborate support systems that delivered not just ammunition and food, but medical supplies for sophisticated field hospitals, fuel for thousands of vehicles, spare parts for complex equipment, and specialized munitions for different tactical situations. Japanese supply lines to Saipan had grown increasingly tenuous throughout early 1944 as American submarines and aircraft decimated merchant convoys attempting to deliver reinforcements and supplies. The island's garrison survived on stockpiles accumulated before American naval forces tightened their blockade, with no realistic prospect of resupply once battle commenced. Saito calculated his forces possessed perhaps 60 days of ammunition and 90 days of food at normal consumption rates, estimates that assumed Japanese troops would fight with the efficiency and supply discipline drilled into them during training. The American invasion fleet appeared off Saipan's western coast on June 30th, 1944, comprising over 300 vessels that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. Saito observed the armada through field glasses from his command post on Mount Tapochau, counting battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and dozens of specialized vessels whose purposes remained unclear but whose presence suggested logistical capabilities that Japanese intelligence had failed to adequately assess. The pre-invasion bombardment that commenced on June 30th exceeded anything Saito had witnessed during his 26 years of military service. Battleship main batteries delivered shells, weighing over 1 ton with mechanical regularity, pulverizing coastal fortifications that had required months to construct. Cruiser and destroyer guns swept beach areas with curtains of high explosive that transformed defensive positions into cratered moonscapes. Aircraft from the carriers offshore dropped bombs and napalm with precision that suggested sophisticated targeting systems rather than the crude area bombing Japanese forces employed. What troubled Saito more than the bombardment's intensity was its systematic nature. American gunfire methodically worked through predetermined target lists rather than firing random harassment barrages. Naval observers adjusted fire based on observed results, concentrating firepower on positions that showed resistance while bypassing areas already neutralized. The coordination between naval guns, aircraft, and what appeared to be underwater demolition teams clearing beach obstacles revealed planning sophistication that Japanese amphibious doctrine had never considered necessary. The landing operations that began on June 15th demonstrated the full scope of American logistical capabilities in ways that rendered Saito's defensive preparations largely irrelevant. The first waves came ashore in specialized landing craft that delivered troops directly onto beaches despite heavy surf and Japanese defensive fire. Behind the assault infantry came waves of vehicles, artillery pieces, and supplies loaded onto amphibious craft that shuttled continuously between the invasion fleet and expanding beachheads. Saito's forward observers reported scenes that seemed incomprehensible to officers trained in Japanese logistics methods. American troops established supply dumps on the beaches within hours of Stranik, landing, accumulating ammunition, rations, water, and medical supplies faster than Japanese forces could interdict them through counterattacks. Bulldozers carved roads through beach obstacles and inland terrain, creating transportation networks that allowed rapid movement of supplies from shore to frontline positions. Within 24 hours of the initial landing, Americans had constructed what appeared to be permanent supply installations that exceeded the capacity of facilities Japanese forces had built over months of preparation. The artillery support American infantry received particularly astounded Japanese observers accustomed to carefully rationed fire missions. American guns fired continuously, delivering shells in quantities that suggested unlimited ammunition supplies rather than the careful conservation Japanese artillery practiced. Forward observers coordinated fire missions through radio communications that allowed near-instantaneous response to infantry requests, while counter-battery fire targeted Japanese guns with accuracy that suggested sophisticated detection equipment rather than visual observation. Colonel Hirakushi's intelligence section began systematically documenting American supply operations from observation posts scattered across Japanese-controlled territory, attempting to calculate tonnages flowing ashore and consumption rates that sustained the expanding offensive against Saito's defensive positions. The methodology Hirakushi employed reflected his training in intelligence analysis at Staff College, where he had learned systematic observation techniques designed to extract maximum information from limited data. His teams counted vessels, arriving and departing, estimated cargo volumes based on how ships rode in the water before and after unloading, measured the dimensions of supply dumps visible in photographs and direct observation, and catalogued the types of equipment and materials flowing ashore to understand what Americans considered necessary for combat operations. The numbers emerging from this analysis defied belief, even as observation confirmed their accuracy with disturbing consistency. By June 20th, just 5 days after the initial landings, Hirakushi estimated Americans had landed over 50,000 tons of supplies to support approximately 60,000 combat troops and supporting units that had come ashore during the invasion's first phase. The tonnage represented more material than the entire Japanese garrison on Saipan had accumulated during months of peacetime preparation before American submarines and aircraft had severed reliable supply lines to the island. Hirakushi's reports broke down the supply tonnage by category to help Saito understand not just the volume but the composition of American logistics. Ammunition accounted for perhaps 20% of total tonnage. 10,000 tons of artillery shells, small arms rounds, and grenades represented firepower Japanese forces could never match. Food supplies provided American troops with rations delivering 3,000 calories daily, far exceeding the minimal rice that sustained Japanese defenders on inadequate nutrition that weakened them even without combat stress. Medical supplies represented another category that Japanese logistics barely acknowledged. American forces devoted substantial cargo capacity to pharmaceuticals, surgical equipment, blood plasma, and bandages that equipped field hospitals capable of performing operations requiring major civilian facilities in Japan. Fuel supplies astounded Hirakushi most. Americans landed thousands of barrels daily to support vehicle fleets that operated continuously. Trucks shuttled supplies, jeeps carried personnel, tanks provided firepower, and bulldozers carved roads. The fuel consumption exceeded Japanese planning assumptions by orders of magnitude. Engineers came ashore with equipment that allowed rapid infrastructure development, communication units, established networks linking frontline units with headquarters. Quartermaster units operated distribution systems that tracked inventory and ensured scheduled deliveries rather than emergency responses. The entire logistics system operated with mechanical efficiency, suggesting careful planning and abundant resources rather than improvisation. By June 25th, Hirakushi's staff calculated Americans had landed approximately 95,000 tons. The tonnage exceeded total Japanese stockpiles and continued growing as cargo operations proceeded around the clock. Supply dumps stretched for miles along the coast, protected by anti-aircraft batteries and security perimeters. The systematic nature of American logistics particularly impressed Hirakushi's teams. Supplies flowed through organized systems, directing ammunition to artillery positions, rations to infantry units, medical supplies to field hospitals, and fuel to vehicle parks according to planned schedules. Traffic control directed. Continuous truck streams along roads. Engineers had constructed for logistics support. Cargo handling teams unloaded vessels with efficiency, suggesting extensive training, using forklifts and cranes that moved supplies at rates manual labor could never achieve. Hirakushi's reports showed American logistics personnel outnumbered combat troops in many units, ratios Japanese doctrine would consider wasteful, but results demonstrated that extensive support enhanced combat effectiveness more than additional rifle companies. American infantry advanced confidently, knowing ammunition, medical care, and reinforcements would arrive when needed. Japanese troops fought knowing once initial supplies were exhausted, no resupply would come regardless of tactical situation. Japanese artillery targeted supply dumps whenever observation posts identified concentrations, firing precious shells at beaches where American cargo continued accumulating. Strikes occasionally scored direct hits, detonating ammunition stockpiles in spectacular explosions, yet within hours, American work parties cleared debris and resumed operations. The ability to absorb losses and continue functioning demonstrated logistics resilience. Japanese supply systems completely lacked. Night infiltration attacks against supply areas similarly failed to achieve lasting disruption. American security forces responded with coordinated counterattacks that killed Japanese attackers before they could escape. Even successful raids that destroyed significant material merely created temporary shortages that fresh cargo deliveries remedied within days, demonstrating Americans could replace losses faster than Japanese forces could inflict them. Thousands of American vehicles operated continuously, consuming gasoline at rates exceeding total Japanese fuel deliveries during months of peacetime operations. Tank farms stored petroleum products sufficient for months of operations. Japanese forces moved supplies by hand or draft, animals when available, conserving scarce fuel for combat vehicles that often sat immobilized. The fuel shortage paralyzed Japanese logistics more effectively than American attacks could achieve. Construction equipment transformed terrain with impossible speed. Bulldozers carved roads in hours rather than weeks. Japanese engineers required. Cranes handled cargo tonnages that would require entire companies if moved manually. The equipment multiplied personnel effectiveness through mechanization, rather than simply assigning more workers. Communications systems demonstrated technological sophistication. Japanese forces could not match. Radio networks linked units with artillery, naval gunfire, and air controllers with reliability enabling real-time coordination. Japanese systems functioned adequately in peacetime, but failed under combat stress, leaving units isolated when equipment was damaged or operators were killed. By early July, Saito recognized that continued resistance served no military purpose beyond delaying the inevitable, at cost of additional casualties that would not influence the campaign's ultimate outcome. American logistics ensured that offensive operations would continue regardless of Japanese defensive efforts, grinding forward with mechanical inevitability that tactical brilliance could not halt and courage could not deflect. The 165,000 tons landed in 3 weeks would grow to 200,000, then 300,000. Then, whatever quantities American supply planners determined necessary to support operations aimed at securing Saipan completely and preparing for subsequent campaigns against Tinian, Guam, and eventually targets closer to Japan's home islands. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The final Japanese defensive positions in Saipan's northern highlands faced American forces supplied with ammunition, food, medical care, and equipment that sustained offensive operations at intensities. Japanese defenders could not match with their dwindling resources and deteriorating physical condition. Artillery barrages preceded every American advance, delivering explosive tonnages that pulverized fortifications before infantry ever approached defensive lines. Naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers offshore supplemented ground artillery when particularly stubborn positions required additional firepower beyond what field guns could provide. Airstrikes delivered by carrier aircraft provided yet another dimension of fire support that Japanese forces lacked means to counter effectively, having long since lost air superiority to American carrier groups that operated with impunity throughout the Marianas. Saito ordered his staff to maintain detailed records of American supply operations, recognizing that these observations might prove valuable for future defensive campaigns, even if Saipan itself could not be held. His intelligence officers photographed American supply dumps when observation posts permitted, sketched layouts of beach installations, and compiled estimates of daily tonnage flows based on vessel counts and cargo handling observations. The picture emerging from this systematic surveillance revealed operational methods fundamentally different from Japanese military practice. Where Japanese forces concentrated on combat troops and basic ammunition supplies, Americans devoted enormous resources to support systems that sustained combat effectiveness over extended periods. Medical evacuation systems removed wounded personnel from front lines within hours, providing treatment that saved lives. Japanese forces would have written off as inevitable combat casualties. Engineer units constructed roads, bridges, and facilities with equipment and speed that allowed rapid expansion of controlled territory. By June 25, Hirakushi's staff calculated that Americans had landed approximately 95,000 tons of supplies to support their expanding control of southern and central Saipan. The tonnage exceeded total Japanese stockpiles on the island and continued growing as cargo operations proceeded around the clock, despite Japanese artillery harassment and occasional air attacks. American supply dumps, visible from Saito's observation posts, stretched for miles along the coast, protected by anti-aircraft batteries and security perimeters that prevented effective Japanese interdiction. The systematic nature of American logistics particularly impressed Saito's staff. Supplies did not pile randomly on beaches waiting for distribution. Instead, they flowed through organized systems that directed ammunition to artillery positions, rations to infantry units, medical supplies to field hospitals, and fuel to vehicle parks, according to carefully planned schedules. Traffic control personnel directed continuous streams of trucks moving supplies inland, while cargo handling teams unloaded vessels with efficiency that suggested extensive training and standardized procedures. Japanese counterattacks against American positions revealed another dimension of logistical disparity that traditional tactics could not overcome. When Japanese forces managed to penetrate American lines, they encountered opponents supplied with ammunition quantities that allowed sustained defensive fire rather than carefully rationed volleys. American infantry possessed automatic weapons, abundant grenades, and support from artillery that responded within minutes to calls for fire support. Even when Japanese troops achieved tactical surprise, material disadvantages prevented exploitation of temporary advantages. The medical treatment American forces provided to Japanese prisoners astounded Saito's officers who witnessed it during negotiations over wounded personnel. Americans treated captured Japanese soldiers with the same surgical care provided to their own troops, using medical supplies and techniques that Japanese military hospitals in Tokyo could not match. Prisoners reported receiving antibiotics, blood transfusions, and surgical procedures that saved lives from wounds. Japanese medical doctrine considered mortal. The disparity in medical capabilities reflected broader patterns of logistical sophistication that permeated every aspect of American military operations. By the end of June, Hirakushi's calculations showed Americans had landed over 100 to 30,000 tons of supplies to support operations that had secured most of southern Saipan and were advancing toward the island's northern highlands. The tonnage represented more material than Japanese forces had accumulated during months of preparation, landed in just 2 weeks of continuous cargo operations. The rate of supply flow showed no signs of decreasing, suggesting American logistics could sustain offensive operations indefinitely rather than culminating after initial stockpiles were exhausted. Saito's defensive strategy had assumed that determined resistance would impose unsustainable casualties on American forces, eventually forcing operational pauses that might create opportunities for counteroffensives. But American logistics undermined this assumption by sustaining combat effectiveness despite casualties that would have paralyzed Japanese operations. Medical evacuation removed wounded personnel from battle within hours rather than days, while replacement troops flowed ashore to maintain unit strength. Artillery ammunition consumption that would have exhausted Japanese supplies in days continued for weeks without apparent reduction in fire support availability. The systematic advance of American forces through Saipan's interior demonstrated how logistics translated into tactical advantages that Japanese courage and tactical skill could not overcome. American infantry advanced behind artillery barrages that pulverized defensive positions before. Ground troops made contact. When Japanese defenders managed to halt American advances, naval gunfire delivered shells with precision that suggested sophisticated fire control systems. Airstrikes provided additional firepower that allowed American ground forces to call in devastating attacks on strongpoints that resisted conventional assault. Saito's command post on Mount Tapochau provided observation of the entire southern half of Saipan, allowing his staff to witness the full scope of American logistical operations supporting the expanding offensive. What they observed challenged every assumption Japanese military doctrine made about how wars were fought and won. The Americans had not simply brought more supplies than Japanese forces. They had constructed an entire industrial system on Saipan's beaches, capable of sustaining operations at intensities. Japanese logistics could not match even under ideal conditions. By July 3rd, Hirakushi's final calculations estimated Americans had landed 165,000 tons of supplies in 3 weeks of operations. The figure exceeded Japanese intelligence estimates of what modern logistics could achieve. Yet, observation confirmed its accuracy. The tonnage supported over 60,000 American combat troops, plus supporting units that outnumbered Japanese garrison forces remaining in Saipan's northern highlands. More significantly, it demonstrated operational capabilities that made Japanese defensive strategies obsolete, regardless of terrain advantages or fighting spirit. The supply dumps visible from Japanese positions told a story of industrial warfare that Japan's military leadership had failed to comprehend. Americans stockpiled not just ammunition for current operations, but reserves sufficient for weeks of additional combat. Fuel supplies supported thousands of vehicles that provided mobility Japanese forces could not match. Medical facilities provided care that saved American lives, while Japanese wounded died from treatable injuries due to lack of supplies and evacuation capabilities. The disparity in logistics had transformed warfare from contests between armies into struggles between industrial systems. Saito understood that Saipan's fall was inevitable, not because Japanese troops lacked courage or skill, but because logistics determined modern warfare's outcome more decisively than tactical excellence. His final reports to Imperial General Headquarters emphasized this reality with clinical precision that contradicted propaganda narratives about spiritual superiority overcoming material disadvantages. The Americans had not won through better tactics or braver soldiers. They had won by constructing logistics systems that made traditional military virtues irrelevant against opponents who could sustain combat operations indefinitely through superior industrial capacity. The mathematical reality of 100 to 65,000 tons in 3 weeks represented more than supply. Statistics. It revealed the fundamental transformation of warfare from contests between armies to struggles between industrial economies. Japan had sent soldiers armed with courage and tactical doctrine, developed over centuries of military tradition. America had sent an industrial system capable of delivering overwhelming material support to forces fighting thousands of miles from home bases. The outcome was never in doubt once that disparity became apparent. Saito's intelligence staff compiled their observations into detailed reports that documented American logistics methods with systematic precision. The photographs, sketches, and tonnage calculations they produced would remain classified in Japanese military archives for decades, revealing truths about modern warfare that neither propaganda nor traditional military doctrine acknowledged. American logistics had not simply supported operations on Saipan, it had redefined what military operations could achieve when industrial capacity, rather than warrior spirit, determined outcomes. The systematic nature of American supply operations revealed planning sophistication that Japanese forces had never considered necessary. Every aspect of the logistics system operated according to carefully designed procedures that maximized efficiency and sustained combat operations. At tempos Japanese doctrine considered impossible, cargo handling followed standardized methods that allowed rapid unloading regardless of vessel type. Supply distribution employed dedicated transportation units that delivered materials according to predetermined schedules rather than improvised responses to emergency requests. Medical evacuation systems removed casualties with mechanical efficiency that saved lives through rapid treatment. Japanese observers noted that American logistics personnel outnumbered combat troops in many units, a ratio that Japanese doctrine would have considered wasteful of manpower. But the results demonstrated that extensive support systems enhanced combat effectiveness more than additional rifle companies. American infantry advanced with confidence, knowing that ammunition, medical care, and reinforcements would arrive when needed. Japanese troops fought knowing that once initial supplies were exhausted, no resupply would come regardless of tactical situation or casualties suffered. The fuel logistics particularly impressed Saito's staff as evidence of American industrial capacity. Thousands of vehicles operated continuously throughout American-controlled areas, consuming gasoline at rates that exceeded total Japanese fuel deliveries to Saipan during months of peacetime supply operations. Tank farms visible near the beaches stored petroleum products in quantities sufficient to support operations for months, while tanker vessels continued delivering additional supplies that expanded rather than merely maintained stockpiles. Japanese forces, by contrast, moved supplies by hand or draft animals, when available, conserving scarce fuel for combat vehicles that often sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. The construction equipment Americans employed transformed terrain with speed that seemed impossible to observers accustomed to manual labor methods. Bulldozers carved roads through jungle and rough ground in hours, rather than the weeks Japanese engineers required using hand tools. Graders created airfield surfaces that allowed aircraft operations within days of securing territory. Cranes loaded and unloaded cargo with efficiency that eliminated the bottlenecks Japanese logistics suffered from labor-intensive handling methods. The equipment represented industrial capacity applied to military logistics, multiplying effectiveness of personnel through mechanical advantage rather than increased manpower. Communications systems supporting American operations demonstrated technological sophistication that Japanese forces could not match. Radio networks linked frontline units with artillery batteries, naval gunfire support, and air controllers with reliability that allowed real-time coordination of combined arms operations. American commanders received intelligence updates, casualty reports, and supply status information with speed that enabled rapid decision-making impossible when communications depended on runners or telegraphic links. Japanese forces operated with communications systems that failed under combat conditions, leaving units isolated and unable to coordinate responses to American advances. By early July, Saito recognized that continued resistance served no military purpose beyond delaying the inevitable at cost of additional casualties. American logistics ensured that offensive operations would continue, regardless of Japanese defensive efforts, grinding forward with mechanical inevitability that tactical brilliance could not halt. The 165,000 tons landed in 3 weeks would grow to 200,000, then 300,000 as operations expanded to secure Saipan completely and prepare for subsequent campaigns against other Mariana Islands. The final Japanese defensive positions in Saipan's northern highlands faced American forces supplied with ammunition, food, medical care, and equipment that sustained offensive operations at intensities Japanese defenders could not match. Artillery barrages preceded every American advance, delivering explosive tonnages that pulverized fortifications before infantry ever approached. Naval gunfire supplemented ground artillery when particularly stubborn positions required additional firepower. Saito's observations about American logistics capabilities would prove prophetic for subsequent Pacific campaigns. The pattern established at Saipan, repeated at Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa with numbing regularity. American forces landed, overwhelming supply tonnages that sustained operations, regardless of Japanese resistance, intensity, or duration, grinding forward through systematic application of firepower and resources that made defensive efforts futile exercises in delaying inevitable defeat. Medical evacuation saved American lives, while Japanese wounded died untreated in caves and foxholes, where they lay beyond reach of non-existent medical care. Ammunition expenditures that would have exhausted Japanese stockpiles in days continued for weeks without reducing fire support, availability, or forcing operational pauses to accumulate supplies. The systematic approach to logistics transformed island campaigns from desperate struggles into methodical advances, where material superiority predetermined outcomes before combat even began. Japanese intelligence analysis of American logistics methods revealed uncomfortable truths about modern warfare that propaganda narratives emphasizing spiritual superiority could not acknowledge publicly. Individual courage and tactical skill, virtues Japanese military culture celebrated and cultivated through rigorous training, mattered less in determining campaign outcomes than organizational capacity to deliver supplies, coordinate complex operations involving multiple service branches and weapon systems, and sustain combat effectiveness over extended periods that tested endurance more than momentary heroism. Japanese forces possessed brave soldiers willing to die for their emperor and competent officers, trained in tactical doctrines developed over decades of military experience, but they lacked logistics systems capable of matching American material advantages that translated superior resources into overwhelming combat power. The disparity meant that tactical victories, when occasionally achieved through aggressive attacks or skillful defensive positioning, could not be exploited into strategic success because logistics limitations prevented sustained, offensive operations or adequately reinforcing positions against inevitable American counterattacks. Japanese commanders who achieved tactical surprise or local superiority found themselves unable to capitalize on temporary advantages because their units lacked ammunition for extended firefights, fuel to pursue retreating enemies, or medical supplies to treat casualties and return lightly wounded personnel to combat duties. American forces, by contrast, could afford tactical setbacks knowing that logistics would deliver replacement personnel, equipment, and supplies that restored combat effectiveness within days rather than the weeks or months Japanese reinforcement required when it came at all. The medical dimension of American logistics demonstrated how industrial capacity translated into combat advantages beyond firepower. Field hospitals provided surgical care comparable to stateside facilities, using blood plasma, antibiotics, and skilled surgeons. Evacuation systems removed casualties within hours, preventing deaths from shock and infection that killed Japanese, wounded lying untreated for days. American soldiers knew wounds not immediately fatal would receive treatment offering genuine survival chances. Japanese troops accepted that serious wounds meant death regardless of outcome. This created morale advantages complementing material superiority, with American troops willing to take calculated risks, knowing evacuation would come if hit. The medical dimension of American logistics particularly demonstrated how industrial capacity translated into combat advantages beyond simple firepower superiority. Field hospitals on Saipan provided surgical care comparable to stateside civilian facilities, using blood plasma, antibiotics, and skilled surgeons to save lives from wounds that Japanese medical doctrine considered mortal. Evacuation systems removed casualties from combat zones within hours, preventing deaths from shock, infection, and complications that killed Japanese wounded who lay untreated for days. The survival rates American forces achieved through sophisticated medical logistics created morale advantages that complemented material superiority in weapons and ammunition. Supply discipline within American forces impressed Japanese observers as evidence of systematic training rather than improvised responses to supply shortages that Japanese troops constantly faced. American troops did not hoard or waste supplies despite their abundance, consuming ammunition according to doctrine that balanced firepower application with reasonable conservation of resources. Food distribution ensured all personnel received adequate nutrition without the favoritism that characterized Japanese supply systems, where officers ate well, while enlisted troops subsisted on minimal rations. The systematic approach to logistics extended through entire organizations, creating efficiency that multiplied effectiveness of available resources, even when those blatant explosions Resources seemed unlimited compared to Japanese scarcity. The transportation networks Americans constructed on Saipan demonstrated engineering capabilities that Japanese forces could not duplicate even with unlimited time and resources that they manifestly lacked. Roads connected beaches to frontline positions, with routes designed for heavy truck traffic carrying multi-ton loads rather than footpaths, suitable only for soldiers carrying equipment on their backs. Bridges spanned ravines and streams, with structures capable of supporting tanks and loaded cargo vehicles, rather than the makeshift crossings. Japanese engineers improvised using logs and rope. Traffic control systems managed continuous flows of vehicles, without the congestion that plagued Japanese attempts at mechanized supply operations during rare instances when fuel availability permitted such movements. The infrastructure represented industrial civilization applied to military logistics, creating capabilities that agricultural societies could not achieve regardless of determination or willingness to sacrifice for national objectives. Saito's final report to Imperial General Headquarters, composed during late June as American forces consolidated control of southern Saipan and prepared drives toward the island's northern highlands, emphasized logistics as the decisive factor in modern warfare that Japanese doctrine had failed to adequately recognize or address through institutional reform. His analysis compared American and Japanese supply capabilities with mathematical precision that contradicted propaganda claims about spiritual superiority compensating for material disadvantages. The 165,000 tons Americans landed in 3 weeks exceeded Japanese logistics capacity by orders of magnitude, creating combat advantages that tactics and courage could not overcome, no matter how skillfully commanders employed forces or how bravely soldiers fought when committed to hopeless battles. The report noted that American logistics enabled offensive operations at tempos Japanese forces could not sustain even when defending favorable terrain that should have multiplied defensive effectiveness. Artillery support never diminished, despite continuous fire missions that would have exhausted Japanese ammunition within days of commencing similar bombardments. Medical care sustained combat effectiveness by returning lightly wounded personnel to duty and evacuating serious casualties before infections or complications caused deaths. Food supplies provided adequate nutrition that maintained physical performance, while Japanese troops weakened from malnutrition even when not under direct attack. The systematic advantages of American logistics accumulated into overwhelming superiority that predetermined campaign outcomes, regardless of tactical developments during actual combat operations. Japanese defenders remaining in Saipan's northern sector understood that further resistance served no strategic purpose beyond maintaining honor through death rather than surrender. Yet they fought on from combination of military discipline, cultural values, emphasizing death over captivity, and absence of alternatives that Japanese military doctrine acknowledged as honorable. American loudspeaker broadcasts offered surrender terms and promised humane treatment, but Japanese military culture made capitulation impossible for most personnel, regardless of tactical situation or strategic hopelessness. The final battles in Saipan's caves and highlands became exercises in applying American firepower against defenders who lacked supplies, medical care, or hope of relief, yet refused to surrender despite impossible odds. The civilian population trapped in Saipan's northern areas suffered consequences of Japan's logistical and moral failures as severely as military personnel who at least possessed weapons and training for combat situations. Japanese authorities had provided no evacuation plans for civilians, minimal food stockpiles for non-combatants, and no medical facilities for families caught in the combat zone. American forces attempted to minimize civilian casualties through warnings and humanitarian aid offers, but Japanese propaganda convinced many civilians that capture meant torture and death, leading to tragedies at Marpi Point and other locations where families chose suicide over surrender. The civilian deaths reflected Japan's systematic failure to plan for their welfare in military operations, another dimension of institutional shortcomings that characterized Japanese logistics throughout the Pacific War. The suicide attacks that characterized Saipan's final days demonstrated courage that American forces respected even while recognizing such tactics' futility against opponents with overwhelming material advantages. Japanese soldiers charged American positions armed with little more than determination and bayonets, achieving temporary penetrations before being annihilated by defensive firepower that concentrated automatic weapons, artillery, and tank fire against exposed attackers. The attacks accomplished nothing of military value, while consuming lives that might have been preserved through surrender, but Japanese military culture permitted no alternatives to death when defeat became inevitable. General Saito's death on July 6, 1944, came as American forces prepared final assaults against Japanese positions in Saipan's northern highlands, where remaining defenders clustered in caves and improvised fortifications that offered temporary protection from American firepower. His final message to remaining troops acknowledged that further resistance was militarily pointless, but urged continued fighting to maintain honor and delay American advances that would eventually overwhelm remaining positions regardless of Japanese determination. The message reflected Japanese military culture's emphasis on death over surrender, creating tactical situations where American forces faced opponents who would fight until killed, regardless of strategic circumstances, that made continued resistance futile. Organized Japanese resistance on Saipan ended on July 9, 1944, though small groups continued fighting for weeks afterward in isolated pockets where they had been bypassed during the main advances. American casualties totaled over 16,000, including 3,000 killed, reflecting the intensity of combat even against opponents who lacked adequate logistics support and faced overwhelming material disadvantages. Japanese casualties exceeded 30,000 military personnel, plus thousands of civilian deaths, demonstrating the consequences of defensive strategies unsupported by logistics systems capable of sustaining operations against industrially superior opponents who could maintain offensive momentum indefinitely through systematic supply operations. The lessons of Saipan's logistics disparity extended beyond single campaign outcomes to illuminate fundamental truths about modern warfare that remain relevant in contemporary military analysis. Military operations depend on supply systems more decisively than tactical brilliance or individual courage, with forces capable of sustaining operations through systematic logistics, defeating opponents who rely on fighting spirit and initial stockpiles, regardless of comparative warrior quality. Industrial capacity determines strategic outcomes more than battlefield tactics. When conflicts extend beyond brief campaigns, where initial supplies suffice for achieving limited objectives, American logistics at Saipan established patterns that characterized all subsequent Pacific campaigns, with each operation beginning with massive supply buildups that sustained offensives until objectives were secured. Medical systems saved American lives through sophisticated evacuation and treatment that Japanese forces could not provide their wounded. Ammunition expenditures that Japanese forces could not match continued indefinitely through supply chains, linking Pacific battlefields to continental production facilities. The systematic approach to logistics transformed warfare from contests between armies into struggles between industrial systems where predetermined outcomes reflected organizational capacity rather than battlefield courage or tactical innovation. The tonnage figures Saito's intelligence staff calculated with such care, 165,000 tons in 3 weeks, represented more than supply statistics. They quantified the industrial revolution in warfare that Japan's military leadership failed to recognize until too late. Modern combat required not just brave soldiers and competent tactics, but logistics systems capable of sustaining operations over time and distance. Japan brought warrior traditions to conflicts where supply chains determined victory more decisively than samurai spirit. The mathematical reality of tonnage delivered and consumed predicted outcomes as reliably as battle casualties once the disparity became apparent. Intelligence analysts studying Japanese documents captured after Saipan's fall discovered Saito's logistics reports and recognized their significance as evidence of how mid-level Japanese commanders perceived the growing disparity between opposing capabilities. The reports provided rare documentation of how systematic American logistics appeared to opponents accustomed to supply methods, emphasizing minimal consumption and maximum endurance. Saito's clinical analysis of tonnages, landed, supply types delivered, and systems supporting American operations demonstrated that some Japanese officers understood their nation faced opponents whose industrial capacity made traditional military virtues insufficient for achieving strategic success against enemies who could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. Modern military logistics doctrine incorporates lessons from Saipan's campaign about the decisive importance of supply systems in sustaining operations beyond brief tactical engagements. The 165,000 tons Americans landed in 3 weeks represented organizational capability that multiplied combat effectiveness more than additional rifle divisions could have achieved through simple additions to frontline strength. Professional military education uses Saipan as case study, demonstrating how logistics determines operational tempo, influences tactical outcomes, and ultimately predicts strategic success or failure, regardless of other factors, including courage, tactical skill, or temporary advantages gained through surprise or aggressive action that cannot be sustained without adequate supply support. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.